Berlin, spring of 1787. Inside a cold chamber of the royal palace, a Prussian princess took her final breath after years of battling cancer and despair. She was Amelia of Prussia, sister to Frederick the Great. No throne, no marriage, no political legacy. Amelia died as she had lived, hidden in the shadow of others. Her passing became a silent emblem of the forgotten fate of royal women. Born among gilded walls, yet erased from history's memory. Berlin, 1723. A city of gray stone, military parades, and the echo of boots on cobblestones. It was here, in this rigid capital of Prussia, that Princess Amelia was born. Her father was Frederick William I, a man history would remember not for gentleness, but for iron discipline. He was called the Soldier King. His court was unlike that of Versailles or Vienna or Dresden. There were no fountains glittering under candlelight, no endless balls drenched in perfume and music. Instead, Berlin was a barracks wearing the mask of a palace. In that palace, little Amelia took her first steps. Her childhood was shaped not by the warm indulgence of royal tutors, but by a father who believed that softness was poison. Every hour of the day was ordered, meals at strict times, prayers at strict times, lessons at strict times. To be late was not merely rude, it was dangerous. Frederick William's temper was infamous, and he did not spare his children from the lash of his anger. Amelia was the youngest daughter. In a household filled with princes and princesses, she was easy to overlook. The boys were trained for war. The elder sisters were groomed for political marriages. Amelia, smaller, quieter, often slipped into the background. She learned early the survival skill of silence. Silence, in fact, was the language of her home. Her father's voice dominated everything. He wanted sons who would become officers, not dreamers. Daughters who would serve dynastic alliances, not seek individuality. In such a climate, Amelia's laughter, when it dared to appear, seemed out of place, like a bird chirping in the middle of a drill ground. The court itself was an extension of Frederick William's obsessions. Visitors described endless drills of the army. Even at the palace table, talk was of muskets, discipline, and campaigns. Soldiers marched outside the windows. Guards clanged their weapons in the courtyards. For Amelia, home was a cage lined with the echo of drums. And yet, within that harsh environment, she carried the soul of a child. She watched her elder siblings quarrel, struggle, and sometimes rebel against their father's cruelty. Her brother Frederick, only a few years older, tried to run away once. He dreamed of music, of literature, of freedom. He was caught, humiliated, nearly executed. Amelia, too young to interfere, learned the lesson deeply. To desire beauty in Prussia was dangerous. The palace rooms were plain, walls painted in dull colors, furniture simple, almost severe. Frederick William despised extravagance, seeing it as weakness. While other princesses in Europe grew up surrounded by velvet, gold, and tapestries, Amelia's toys were meager, her dresses modest compared to cousins in Hanover or Paris. She lived in a royal home, but one stripped of joy. Her mother, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, tried to soften the sharp edges. She was the daughter of George I of Great Britain, a woman who knew the glitter of other courts. She provided Amelia with small moments of affection, stories whispered at night, or lessons in reading and music. But even Sophia Dorothea could not shield her children from the iron hand of the king. Amelia grew up watching her parents at war with each other. Frederick William despised the refinement his wife brought from Hanover. Sophia Dorothea resented her husband's brutality. Their marriage was a battlefield, and the children were the casualties. For Amelia, family life was not a source of comfort, but a theater of conflict. There are few records of Amelia's words, few letters in her own hand. She did not write manifestos or memoirs. History rarely preserves the quiet ones. But the silence itself is telling. She lived in a household where speaking too loudly could bring punishment, where the safest path was to remain unnoticed. Still, she observed. She listened. She absorbed the weight of her world. One can imagine her sitting at the edge of the palace gardens, watching soldiers march with precision, the air filled with the bark of officers' commands. She would have seen her brothers drilled until exhaustion, her sisters discussed as pawns in diplomatic games, and she, the youngest, waited for a role that never came. The rhythm of her childhood was monotony. Wake up, pray, lessons, meals, walks under supervision, evening prayers, sleep. The bells of discipline rang louder than any music. For a girl with no political destiny, no arranged marriage in sight, the days were shadows passing over her. Yet inside her, the seed of melancholy was already growing. Children who are starved of affection often turn inward. Amelia's world was narrow, but her thoughts could not be policed. Perhaps she dreamed of other courts she had only heard about. Vienna with its music, Paris with its glitter, London with its bustle. Dreams were the only luxury she could afford. She was not rebellious like Frederick, nor ambitious like some of her sisters. She learned resignation early. But resignation has a cost. It leaves the soul vulnerable to despair. By the time Amelia reached her teens, she already bore the weight of invisibility. She was a princess, but without a script. A daughter of the soldier king, but without a mission. In that rigid household, she became a shadow at the table, a quiet presence in corridors, a name barely whispered in diplomatic correspondence. And so her story began, not with triumph, not with joy, but with silence. A silence that would follow her, haunt her, and eventually define her life. History is rarely fair to siblings. One shines, the others disappear. For Princess Amelia, that truth had a name. Frederick II of Prussia. Her brother would become Frederick the Great, philosopher, warrior, reformer, the king whose victories redrew the map of Europe. His legend was carved while he was still alive. He was celebrated in Parisian salons, feared in Vienna, and admired in London. His name filled dispatches and libraries. His figure adorned paintings and medals. But for Amelia, Frederick was not an icon. He was simply her brother, the one who once tried to run from their father's cruelty. The one who had been beaten, humiliated, and nearly executed for disobedience. She knew his humanity before the world knew his glory. Yet the more his star rose, the more her own life was cast into shadow. Because how could any younger sister compete with a figure who dominated the century? Frederick's court became the center of Europe's attention. Voltaire himself visited, leaving behind quills of wit and admiration. Generals traveled from afar to learn from Prussia's armies. Diplomats crowded Berlin, eager for alliances, trade, treaties. And in the midst of this fever of power and intellect, Amelia's name almost never appeared. Her presence in documents is like a faint watermark, barely visible unless you look hard. She was there in the background of ceremonies, present in court life, but never central. Always seated in the wings, always a supporting figure, never the heroine. Frederick's brilliance did not only illuminate, it blinded. As the king built palaces like The narrative of the dynasty became his alone. His sisters, each in their own way, found themselves orbiting him. Some married into other courts, carrying alliances and whispers with them. But Amelia did not marry. She remained in Berlin. That meant she remained under the long growing shadow of her brother. Imagine being Amelia in those years. The city adored Frederick. Songs were sung of his victories. Foreign envoys carried tales of his genius abroad. Statues were commissioned, paintings displayed, books published. The people of Prussia saw their king as almost mythic. And yet, in those same streets, Amelia could walk unrecognized. A princess by blood, but invisible by fate. She was Frederick's sister, yes, but she was never Frederick's equal. In families, shadows are not always cast by cruelty. Sometimes they are cast simply by greatness. When a sun burns that bright, there is little room for other lights. Amelia, with no marriage, no role, no title beyond her birth, had nothing to counterbalance that radiance. She was not a queen who could rival him, not a consort who could claim attention. She was simply a woman of the court, increasingly irrelevant in the eyes of politics and history. And yet, the shadow was heavy. Even in their personal relationship, Frederick's dominance must have been overwhelming. He was witty, sharp, brilliant in conversation. Amelia, reserved and melancholic, could hardly match his charisma. When people remembered evenings at court, they remembered Frederick quoting Latin, not Amelia sitting quietly at the edge of the room. The imbalance grew worse with time. When Frederick won the Battle of Rossbach, when he secured Silesia, when he became the master strategist of the 7 Years' War, his fame erupted like cannon fire across Europe. Amelia, meanwhile, stayed behind in Berlin. She received letters, news, gossip. But she was not part of the campaigns, not part of the victories. She was a bystander to her brother's empire. And history has little patience for bystanders. There is something cruel in how dynasties remember. They carve statues for the kings. They record the treaties. They recount the battles. The women who do not marry, who do not produce heirs, who do not wield power, they fade. Amelia's life was the proof. She existed, yes, but to most, she existed only as a footnote in Frederick's story. Her identity became defined by absence. No marriage, no heirs, no political function, only a brother whose light erased her. This dynamic is not unique to Amelia. History is full of such sisters. Women born into power but denied its use. Women whose lives were not deemed worthy of chronicling because they did not shape states or bear dynasties. They became ghosts before they even died. But Amelia's ghost was particularly pale because of who her brother was. Frederick the Great did not simply rise, he towered. He was the kind of monarch who redefined a century. Next to him, Amelia looked smaller, quieter, more forgettable. And yet, within the silence, there was tragedy. For how does one live knowing that one's life is a shadow play? How does one find meaning when even family reduces you to a comparison? Amelia may not have left letters of protest, but her later melancholy suggests the toll. Depression rarely falls from nowhere. It grows in the soil of invisibility, watered by years of being unseen. Imagine the family dinners. Frederick dazzling with wit, courtiers laughing, ministers discussing war and treaties. And Amelia, at the far end of the table, her words unheard, her thoughts unrecorded. She was there, yet not truly present. A sister, a princess, a ghost. The shadow of Frederick the Great was not simply political, it was existential. For Amelia, it meant living a life always measured by someone else's success. A life where her worth was defined not by who she was, but by who she was not. And as the years passed, that weight pressed deeper. Frederick would rise higher. Amelia would sink further. The world remembers him as the Great. It remembers her, if at all, as his sister. For most princesses of the 18th century, destiny arrived in the shape of a marriage contract, not for Amelia. Her sisters had been paraded before Europe like glittering pawns in a grand game of dynastic chess. Marriages tied Prussia to Brunswick, to Bayreuth, to far-off thrones. Each sister was given a role, however transactional, to carry a dowry, to produce heirs, to build alliances. But Amelia remained, unwed, unchosen, forgotten. Why? The reasons were never written clearly. That is part of the tragedy. Historians point to several possibilities. Perhaps her health was fragile, discouraging suitors. Perhaps negotiations failed, as Europe's monarchs sought alliances elsewhere. Perhaps Frederick William's temper and erratic politics ruined prospects before they began. Or perhaps Amelia simply never became a priority in the calculations of her family. But the result is beyond doubt. She never married. In a time when marriage was the only recognized path for a princess to claim importance, Amelia's life narrowed. Without a husband, she had no household of her own. Without children, she had no legacy. Without alliances, she had no diplomatic weight. She lived in a palace, but she was invisible in the machinery of power. Imagine the humiliation. Other princesses left Berlin in processions of carriages, veils fluttering, bells ringing. Cities welcomed them with fireworks and parades. Their names were spoken in treaties, their signatures placed on contracts that bound kingdoms together. Amelia, meanwhile, stayed behind. A princess without a wedding dress, a name without a treaty, a life without ceremony. In the glittering map of Europe's marriages, she was the gap, the blank space. This absence was not only political, it was personal. For in that world, a woman without marriage was viewed with suspicion, pity, or neglect. Court gossip might have painted her as unwanted, too plain, too weak, too ill. We cannot know the whispers, but we can imagine them. Whispers linger in palaces longer than marble. The cruel irony was that Amelia may not have even desired a throne. She was not known for ambition. She did not plot like some of her sisters, yet the very lack of marriage robbed her of any formal role. She became what her contemporaries called superfluous, an extra princess. Born with a title, but with no stage on which to perform it. What does it mean to be extra? It means being present, but not needed. Alive, but unnecessary. A daughter whose existence offers no advantage to the dynasty. And so, Amelia faded further into the background of her brother's reign. Frederick rose to power in 1740, dazzling Europe with victories, reforms, and philosophy. His court became a beacon for intellectuals. But Amelia remained sidelined, her lack of marriage sealing her irrelevance. In her quiet rooms, she must have felt the contrast sharply. Couriers arriving with news of foreign queens, her own sisters, raising children, shaping alliances, ruling courts abroad. Letters filled with accounts of festivals, banquets, births, coronations. And Amelia, still in Berlin, a spectator of other lives. Did she envy them? Did she feel relief, perhaps, at escaping loveless political unions? Or did she feel only the sting of being forgotten? The records are silent. But her later melancholy suggests the weight of emptiness pressed hard. A princess without a husband was an anomaly, and anomalies attract cruelty. There are hints that Amelia's name was occasionally mentioned in negotiations, as if she might be offered, finally, to some minor prince or duke. But nothing ever materialized. Each time, the door closed. Each time, silence followed. Each time, her hopes, if she had them, dissolved. Her identity became defined not by what she did, but by what never happened. Not by action, but by absence. History remembers her less for her life than for the marriage she never had. It is painful to imagine the rituals she never performed. No wedding vows whispered in candlelit chapels. No children placed in her arms. No letters written to faraway courts in her hand. Instead, the ceremonies belonged to others, while she remained locked in the echo of what might have been. And here lies the deeper tragedy. For women of her rank, the denial of marriage was the denial of meaning. In the brutal logic of dynastic Europe, Amelia's worth was measured only by the alliances she could seal, the heirs she could bear. Stripped of both, she was left with nothing. Nothing but her name, nothing but her shadow, nothing but time. And time is cruel. As the years passed, she became known less as a princess and more as a dependent. A woman sustained by her family's wealth, but not honored by its attention. A royal figure without purpose. A flower planted in the courtyard of power, but never allowed to bloom. What happens to such a soul? Some grow bitter, others retreat. Amelia did the latter. She retreated into art, into silence, into melancholy. She lived, but did not thrive. She breathed, but did not shine. Her story is the story of negation. A life defined not by great battles, not by great loves, not by triumph or catastrophe, but by the absence of them all. And yet, absence can wound more deeply than catastrophe. For catastrophe at least leaves marks, stories, legacies. Absence leaves nothing but dust. Amelia of Prussia was not married, and that simple fact shaped everything that followed. When history denies a role, the soul seeks refuge. For Amelia of Prussia, that refuge was art. She had been excluded from politics. She had been denied marriage. She had no children to raise, no alliances to secure. But she still had music. She still had painting. She still had the quiet, stubborn beauty of culture, a beauty that even the harsh court of Prussia could not fully extinguish. Berlin in the mid-18th century was not Paris, nor was it Vienna. It lacked the glitter of the French salons or the grandeur of the Habsburg court. But under Frederick the Great, who himself adored music and philosophy, culture began to bloom. It was here that Amelia carved out her small corner of life. She learned to play. She learned to collect. She became, in her own modest way, a patron. Her father, Frederick William V, had despised extravagance, but Frederick II, though ruthless in war, adored the arts. He played the flute, composed sonatas, corresponded with Voltaire. The irony is sharp. The brother whose brilliance overshadowed Amelia in politics also opened the path that allowed her to breathe in art. She gathered musicians. She supported painters. She filled her private rooms with canvases, instruments, sculptures. To others, these were hobbies. To her, they were survival. Because art was not simply entertainment for Amelia. It was oxygen. Imagine her evenings, seated before a harpsichord, hands gliding over keys, each note a whisper against silence. Outside, the sound of soldiers drilling in the streets of Berlin. Inside, the fragile defiance of melody. Music gave her what life had denied her, a voice. She was no Mozart, no Bach. She did not compose symphonies that would echo through centuries. But in her chamber, she could shape sound. She could create order out of chaos, beauty out of despair. Each measure was a way of insisting she existed, even if history preferred to forget her. Art collecting gave her another form of power, not the power of armies or treaties, but the gentler power of taste. She could choose, she could support, she could say, "This is worthy of preservation." In a world where she had no say in her destiny, this was one realm where her judgment mattered. She became known, at least in whispers, as a quiet benefactor of Berlin's cultural life. Artists who might have languished found patrons in her circle. Musicians who played in her chambers felt her attentiveness, her appreciation. For a brief moment, Amelia was not invisible. She was necessary. But even this refuge carried shadows. For though she patronized art, she was not the artist. Though she cherished music, she was not the composer. She remained always on the margins. Standing beside the stage, not on it. Supporting brilliance, not embodying it. There is a cruel paradox here. Art gave her solace, but it also reminded her of what she lacked: the power to create a legacy of her own. She could nurture, but not generate. She could applaud, but not be applauded. And so her patronage was tinged with melancholy. Every painting she collected was a reminder of a life unlived. Every sonata she heard was an echo of possibilities denied. In the silence between notes, she must have felt the weight of her solitude. Still, she clung to art. Because what else was there? Politics belonged to men. Marriage had eluded her. Children would never come. History had no script for her. Art was the only script she could write in the margins. Her devotion gave Berlin a cultural pulse that might otherwise have faded. She was not Sanssouci. She was not Versailles. But she was Amelia, a woman who filled her quiet rooms with beauty, even as her own body began to betray her. Because even in these years of patronage, illness lurked. Her health was never strong. Her energy waned. There were days she could not host, days she could not play. Yet she persisted. The arts became not only a refuge, but also a weapon. Her way of pushing back against the encroaching dark. There is a dignity in that. A princess without power still finding a way to affirm life. A forgotten woman still insisting that beauty matters. But dignity is not the same as happiness. Happiness requires connection, recognition, the sense of being valued. Amelia's art world gave her moments of connection, yes, but fleeting ones. Musicians came, played, left. Painters sold canvases, departed. What remained was Amelia herself, sitting alone in rooms filled with objects that did not speak, and so, even surrounded by art, she was lonely. Even as she touched beauty, she felt absence. The paintings could not love her. The music could not save her. Art softened the edges of despair, but it did not erase despair. When people later remembered Amelia, they noted her patronage. They acknowledged her taste. But even those small recognitions could not hide the truth. She had been peripheral, always peripheral. A woman who supported creativity, but was herself trapped in the role of spectator. It is easy to romanticize such a figure, to imagine her as a noble patroness, luminous in her quiet devotion, but the reality is harsher. Amelia was not remembered as luminous. She was remembered barely at all. Her efforts left little trace in history. The art she supported was eventually absorbed into larger collections. The music she hosted dissolved into silence. What survives is less the record of her patronage and more the record of her sorrow. Still, one must picture her, if only for a moment. The dim light of candles flickering on gilded frames, the soft strains of strings in a chamber, Amelia seated quietly, eyes closed, allowing the music to wash over her. For those minutes, she was not forgotten. She was not the shadow of Frederick. She was not the extra princess. She was a human soul, alive in the beauty she cherished. And perhaps that was enough. Not for history, which erases such moments, but for Amelia herself. Time is merciless. And for Princess Amelia, its cruelty revealed itself in the body. She was in her 40s when the first signs appeared. A persistent pain, a heaviness in the chest, strange swellings that did not fade. At first they were dismissed as fatigue, the natural wear of a life already weighed down by sorrow. But the pain did not retreat. It spread, it deepened, it became a companion she could not silence. The 18th century knew little of medicine. Physicians carried lancets, leeches, and tonics. They spoke of humors, imbalances, hidden vapors in the blood. For Amelia, their visits offered rituals more than cures. She drank the bitter draughts. She endured the bleedings. None of it worked. Slowly, the truth emerged. What she faced was something far darker, far more unyielding. Cancer of the breast. In the age before anesthesia, before surgery as we know it, this was a death sentence stretched into years. There were no hospitals equipped for treatment, no modern drugs, no comfort beyond prayers and compresses. The disease advanced silently, mercilessly. For Amelia, illness became a prison more suffocating than the palace walls. She withdrew. Once she had hosted musicians, gathered artists, kept some fragile foothold in Berlin's cultural life. But pain stole her energy. Pain narrowed her world. Invitations were declined. Public appearances became rare. She became a shadow not only politically, but physically, absent from the gatherings where once she had found some solace. The court noticed, but only in passing. Reports mentioned her declining health. Courtiers whispered of her wasting figure, her pale complexion. She was pitied, but pity is a cold form of remembrance. It neither comforts nor restores. It only reinforces absence. Imagine her mornings, waking in a bed that felt too large, struggling to sit upright, her body betraying her. Servants moving silently, afraid to disturb her fragile peace. The taste of medicine on her tongue, metallic and bitter. The weight of pain pressing against every breath. In those years, Amelia lived between two forms of decay. The decay of her body and the decay of her purpose. Her family had little time for her. Frederick the Great was absorbed in his wars, his reforms, his endless correspondence with philosophers. Other siblings were scattered across Europe, busy with their own courts and dynasties. Amelia was left behind. The youngest daughter, the unmarried one. The sister whose existence no longer served a function. Illness stripped away even the small dignity she had once clung to. She was no longer the patroness seated among paintings, no longer the woman at the harpsichord. She was a patient, defined by her disease. A fragile figure shuffling from chamber to chamber, or confined entirely to her bed. And in those long hours, the mind turns inward. Pain is never just physical. It erodes the spirit. It whispers of futility. It amplifies silence. For Amelia, already prone to melancholy, already haunted by invisibility, illness became more than an affliction of the flesh. It became the embodiment of despair. Each cough, each pang, each sleepless night was a reminder. Life had not given her joy, and now it was taking her strength. The irony is brutal. In a family obsessed with discipline and military vigor, Amelia's body refused obedience. It rebelled. It deteriorated. It turned against her, making her weakness impossible to ignore. Where her father once demanded resilience, her body now proclaimed fragility. Yet she endured. She lived year after year in that twilight state, not fully alive, not yet gone. There were moments of brief reprieve, a day when the pain lessened, an afternoon when she managed to hear music again, a letter from a distant relative that stirred faint connection. But these moments were fleeting, drowned beneath the relentless tide of illness. To be ill in the 18th century was also to be isolated. Disease was frightening, poorly understood. Courtiers kept their distance. Friends visited less often. Servants performed their duties with the formality of ritual, not the intimacy of compassion. The sick became specters even before death arrived. Amelia became such a specter. Her decline was noted in brief, almost clinical terms. Historians record little more than the fact. She suffered from breast cancer. She withdrew from public life. She wasted away. The details, the anguish, the loneliness, the nights of silent tears were not preserved. History does not care for the suffering of forgotten princesses. But one can imagine the long corridors of Berlin's palaces echoing with footsteps, the muffled sound of laughter from distant rooms, unreachable, the silence of her chamber, broken only by coughing, by sighs, by the shuffle of a servant adjusting pillows. This was her kingdom in decline, not a realm of soldiers and ministers, but a realm of pain and shadows. And as her body weakened, so too did her identity. She had once been a sister, a daughter, a patron. Now she was simply the sick princess, nothing more. Her decline was not swift. That too was cruel. Cancer in those days did not rush. It lingered. It gave no mercy of suddenness. It gnawed slowly, each month taking a little more: strength, appetite, movement, dignity. By the time she reached her 60s, Amelia was almost unrecognizable. Thin, frail, ghostly, a figure consumed by pain. The palace that had once been a prison of rules had become a prison of illness. And still, history barely looked her way. While Frederick was immortalized in marble, Amelia decayed in silence. While Prussia marched to new triumphs, Amelia was confined to a bed. While Europe debated kings and queens, Amelia's name faded from memory. Her body was failing, her life was narrowing, and yet she endured, waiting for an end that seemed always near, never mercifully swift. For Amelia of Prussia, decline was not a single event. It was a long descent, step by painful step, into invisibility. Pain of the body is sharp. Pain of the mind is endless. By the late 1750s, Amelia's life was marked not only by illness, but also by a deep, unshakable melancholy. When her mother, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, died in 1757, something inside Amelia broke. The woman who had been her only source of tenderness was gone. And with that loss, Amelia's solitude grew unbearable. Her mother had been a shield. Sophia Dorothea, though often at odds with Frederick William I, had given her children moments of warmth in a palace that prized discipline over affection. For Amelia, who never married, who had no children of her own, the bond with her mother was essential. When that bond was severed, nothing replaced it. She began to withdraw even more. Her attendants noticed it first. She no longer spoke with ease. She avoided gatherings. She lingered by windows, staring at gardens she no longer walked through. She confessed to servants, in whispers, that life felt meaningless, her body a burden, her existence a mistake. Today we would call it depression. In the 18th century, they called it melancholy. Whatever the name, the weight was crushing. Prussia was a kingdom that celebrated strength. Soldiers marched in perfect order. Frederick the Great led campaigns with brilliance. The court sang of victories, of courage, of glory. Against this backdrop, Amelia's sorrow was an embarrassment. What use was a princess who mourned her own life? What place was there for tears in a dynasty that demanded iron? She became, in the eyes of others, a liability. Visitors recorded her sadness with unease. Some wrote of her complaints about illness, others hinted at her fragile nerves, her endless despair. But their tone was not compassionate. It was dismissive. The court had no language for mental anguish. They simply turned away. Isolation deepened. Loneliness became her closest companion. She lived in palaces filled with people, yet none of them truly saw her. Servants tended to her body, yes, but not her spirit. Courtiers acknowledged her rank, but not her suffering. Even her brother Frederick, who loved philosophy and music, seemed to have little patience for her grief. His own struggles with their father had made him hard, perhaps too hard to offer tenderness. So Amelia endured. But endurance without hope is not strength. It is simply survival. Her days blurred, pain in her chest, silence in her chamber, thoughts circling endlessly, whispering of futility. She would often speak of death, not dramatically, but with a weary certainty. Not if, but when. The irony is cruel. She lived in an age when poets romanticized despair. Melancholy was fashionable in art, in music, in the writings of Rousseau. Yet for Amelia, melancholy was not a pose. It was a prison, and no one admired her for it. They only pitied or ignored her. History leaves so few details. We cannot read her diary. None survives. We cannot know the exact words she spoke in her darkest hours, but we can imagine the atmosphere. The heavy drapes drawn to keep out light, the crucifix near her bed, the silence of long afternoons interrupted only by her sighs. And we can hear the repetition of her complaints, noted by attendants. That life was empty, that her body was broken, that her soul had no rest. Depression, like cancer, consumes slowly. It eats away not at flesh, but at meaning. Amelia's meaning had long been denied. No marriage, no children, no politics, no legacy. With her mother's death, even love was gone. What remained was absence, and absence is its own kind of torment. She began to embody what the court least wanted to see: vulnerability. Her brothers and sisters represented alliances, victories, dynasties. Amelia represented frailty, a reminder that even in palaces, sorrow cannot be banished. And so she was left alone with her nameless grief. Sometimes, in history, silence speaks louder than records. The silence around Amelia tells us everything. She was not written into the triumphs of Prussia. She was not painted into grand portraits. She was not sung about in anthems. Her existence was recorded only in the margins. A faint note about illness, a mention of her melancholy, a date of death. But behind those thin records was a life suffocating under despair. One must imagine her in the late hours, the palace quiet, servants gone, only the sound of her breathing in the dark. Her thoughts turning inward, spiraling. No voice to answer her, no one to remind her she was more than a shadow. This is the tragedy of depression in a forgotten life. Not that people are cruel, but that they are indifferent. Indifference erases as surely as death. By the 1760s, Amelia was no longer seen as a participant in court life. She was a sick woman, a sad woman, an echo of what might have been. While Prussia rose in power, while Frederick's fame spread across Europe, Amelia faded from sight, consumed not only by cancer, but by despair. Her sorrow had no name the court would recognize, but it was real as her pain, as real as her slow decline, and it would follow her to the end. In dynasties, memory is currency, and Amelia of Prussia had none. Her sisters had been written into treaties, their marriages linking Berlin to Bayreuth, Brunswick, and beyond. Their names appeared in correspondence between monarchs. Their children became pawns and players in the politics of Europe. But Amelia left no such mark. She had no husband. She had no heirs. She had no kingdom to influence, no court to shape. She was there, yet not there. Present, but absent. History remembers her siblings: Frederick the Great, Wilhelmine of Bayreuth, Louisa Ulrika of Sweden, each carved into Europe's memory, each a line in the vast ledger of power. Amelia's line is almost blank. That blankness is not an accident. Courts preserved what mattered: treaties, victories, births, deaths. Amelia offered none. She was the unmarried sister. She was the sick one. She was the melancholy princess. Labels without story, titles without weight. Even in her own lifetime, she was forgotten. Letters between ministers rarely mention her. Diplomatic reports pass her over. When ambassadors described the Prussian court, they spoke of Frederick, his military genius, his wit, his palaces. When they mentioned Amelia, it was in passing. A note about her health, a sigh about her reclusion. Nothing more. Imagine being erased while still alive. To walk through halls filled with portraits of ancestors and know yours will never be painted. To watch statues rise to honor your brother while you become less than a whisper. To hear the sound of celebrations outside while you sit alone, the world having decided you are unnecessary. That was Amelia's reality. Her invisibility was not dramatic. It was not the result of exile or scandal. It was quieter, more suffocating. She was not hated. She was not disgraced. She was simply ignored. And sometimes indifference is crueler than hatred. Hatred at least acknowledges your existence. Indifference denies it. The role of a princess in the 18th century was clear. You were to marry, to bear heirs, to strengthen the dynasty. Without that role, what remained? Nothing but an empty title. Amelia's rank gave her rooms in palaces, servants to attend her, money to spend. But it gave her no purpose. In that void, she became a ghost. Courtiers walked past her. Ministers overlooked her. Chroniclers barely recorded her. Even her own brother, for all his brilliance, gave her little space in his writings. Frederick left behind volumes of letters, essays, histories. Amelia appears only faintly in their margins. This is how a life is forgotten. Not with one decisive act, but with 1,000 small omissions. Each year, fewer mentions. Each event, fewer appearances. Each memory, less weight. And as she aged, the pattern only deepened. Her sisters' names lived on through their children. Louisa Ulrika's son would become King of Sweden. Wilhelmine's daughter married into Brunswick. Their dynasties carried their memory forward. Amelia had no such vessel. Her name stopped with her. Even her art patronage, her one fragile refuge, left little trace. Collections were absorbed. Musicians she supported were remembered for their work, not for her sponsorship. She had given them life, in a way, but they did not return it. Patrons without power are soon forgotten. It is a strange fate to be royal, yet erased. To be born in a palace, yet remembered less than a servant who left letters behind. But that was Amelia's fate. The deeper tragedy lies in how common her story was. She was not the only forgotten princess of Europe. There were many like her, women born into dynasties, but denied their role, left to drift. Their names appear in genealogies like faint ink, attached to no deeds, no triumphs, no scandals. Just birth, just death, nothing between. But Amelia's case feels sharper because of the contrast. She lived in the same age as Frederick the Great, whose memory towers over the century. She lived in the same family as sisters who ruled foreign courts. To be forgotten in such a family is to vanish twice, once in life, once in history. And vanish she did. When she walked the corridors of Berlin's palaces in her later years, she did so unseen. Servants bowed, yes, but out of duty. Courtiers addressed her, yes, but without interest. Ministers ignored her. The press of Europe had no reason to print her name. She was invisible while still breathing. That is the harshest kind of obscurity, when you are alive, yet treated as though you are already gone. Her story reminds us that history is not written only by the powerful, but also by the selective memory of those who choose what matters. Amelia's life did not fit their idea of importance, and so they forgot her. But forgetting is its own form of cruelty. It strips meaning, it denies dignity, it erases existence. Amelia's tragedy was not only her illness, not only her melancholy, but also the indifference that swallowed her. She was a princess. She lived in palaces. She had servants, wealth, status, yet none of it shielded her from being forgotten. A name without echoes, a life without legacy, a story erased even before death. By the last decade of her life, Amelia no longer belonged to the world outside her windows. She had become a figure of seclusion. The great wars of Frederick the Great were over. The 7 Years' War had shaken Europe, leaving Prussia scarred but victorious. Treaties had been signed, armies demobilized, the map redrawn. Frederick still commanded the court with wit, with brilliance, with iron discipline. His name echoed across Europe. And Amelia? She was barely there. She no longer attended ceremonies, no longer appeared beside her family in public, no longer added her presence to processions or services. For most of Berlin, it was as if she had vanished into stone walls. The palaces of the Hohenzollerns were vast, too vast for one woman fading in obscurity. Amelia drifted among their chambers like a shadow. She had rooms, yes. She had servants, yes. She had wealth, yes. But she had no life that touched the world. Her existence became a cycle of absence. She did not dance. She did not host. She did not marry. She did not bear heirs. She did not reign. And in the end, she did not even appear. Her body was present, but her role was gone. Seclusion is not silence. It is a kind of noise, the noise of thoughts echoing with no answer. Amelia lived in that noise, day after day, season after season. Imagine her at a window in winter. Snow falling on the courtyards of Berlin. Soldiers wrapped in cloaks marching past. Bells tolling in the distance, and inside, Amelia, frail, watching without being seen. A prisoner not of chains, but of neglect. She had once been a patron of music, but music requires company. Her illness had stolen her energy. Her sorrow had stolen her desire. The harpsichord sat silent. The canvases gathered dust. Her chambers became mausoleums of forgotten beauty. Even her attendants, though loyal, kept distance. Servants in royal courts were trained to serve, not to comfort. They brought her food. They lit her candles. They tidied her rooms. But they did not sit by her bed to listen to her loneliness. They performed their duties with precision, not affection. And so Amelia was left to herself. She was not exiled. She was not imprisoned, yet her isolation was as complete as any dungeon. She lived among people, yet apart. She breathed in the same palace as her brother, yet their lives barely touched. Sometimes she was mentioned in reports. The princess is ill. Sometimes she was noted in gossip. The princess is melancholy, but never more. She became, in the last years, almost spectral. The court had no time for her. Frederick, in his twilight, was still consumed by governance, reforms, correspondence. Ministers juggled alliances, generals schemed, diplomats negotiated. And in the midst of it all, Amelia faded, unspoken, unseen. What must it have felt like? To know that the world no longer expected anything from you. No duties, no hopes, no purpose, just waiting, waiting for the end. Her loneliness was not just physical, it was existential. She had lived through 6 decades of European upheaval. She had seen wars, treaties, dynastic shifts. She had watched the rise of her brother into greatness. Yet she herself remained unchanged, untouched by history's hand. She had entered life as an extra princess, and she would leave it the same. Loneliness corrodes. It eats at the spirit. It whispers that your existence does not matter. For Amelia, whose health was already broken, loneliness pressed down like a second illness, a sickness of the soul. She spoke less and less. Attendants reported her silences, her long pauses, her distant eyes. She withdrew from conversation, retreating into thoughts that no one else could reach. Depression, untreated and unnamed, became her companion. And yet, she endured. She endured the winters of Berlin, gray and unforgiving. She endured the slow decline of her body, the constant ache of disease. She endured the absence of family, the neglect of court, the indifference of history. She endured because she had no choice. There is a strange kind of resilience in that. Not triumph, not glory, just survival. But survival without joy is hollow, and Amelia knew it. Her final years were not marked by scandal or drama. They were not interrupted by sudden catastrophe. They simply dwindled. Each day a little smaller, each season a little quieter, each year a little closer to the inevitable end. The world outside did not notice. Wars raged, kings schemed, empires shifted. Amelia's solitude went unrecorded. For Europe, she was already gone. But within those walls, she remained. A lonely figure fading beneath heavy drapes, candles burning low, footsteps echoing in corridors that no longer welcomed her. The lonely final years of Princess Amelia were not a fall from greatness. They were something more haunting, a slow dissolution into nothingness, a disappearance without drama, a vanishing without memory. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic fate of all. On March 30th, 1787, the end finally came. Princess Amelia of Prussia was 63 years old. There was no drama, no battle, no final declaration, just the slow extinguishing of a life already dimmed by pain and sorrow. After years of cancer, years of melancholy, her body could fight no longer. Berlin moved on as usual. Soldiers drilled in the streets, ministers debated policy. Frederick the Great, now an old man himself, still commanded a kingdom. Outside her chamber, the world continued. Inside, Amelia slipped away. She died quietly, surrounded not by crowds, but by attendants. The palace did not tremble at her passing. No bells rang in mourning. No city dressed itself in black. For a princess of Prussia, the ceremony was almost shockingly small. There was a funeral, yes, protocol demanded it. She was carried to the Garnisonkirche in Potsdam, a church of soldiers rather than saints. The service was brief, respectful, dutiful, but not grand. She was not given the honor of a national mourning. No flags at half-mast across Europe. No emissaries rushing to Berlin to pay respects. Her death was not an event of state. It was a footnote. This is how silence buries a life, not with cruelty, with indifference. Compare it to her brother. Frederick the Great would die just 4 years later, in 1791. His death would be recorded across Europe, marked by tributes, memorials, statues. His remains would become contested symbols of Prussian power. Amelia's remains, by contrast, were tucked quietly into a crypt, unremarked by history. Even her resting place did not last. The Garnisonkirche was bombed during World War II. Graves were disturbed, remains moved. Amelia's body was shifted from its original resting place, leaving her memory further fragmented. Her grave no longer a fixed site of remembrance. Even in death, she was unsettled, displaced, forgotten. Think of that irony. Born in a palace, buried in obscurity, moved again by war. A life without permanence, a death without dignity. Her contemporaries hardly noticed. Newspapers of the time gave her passing scant attention. She was not a queen. She was not a regent. She had never been married. She had no heirs to mourn her publicly. Her death was simply another line in the endless chronicles of Berlin. A princess gone. Nothing changed. One might expect that, at least in family, she would be remembered tenderly. Yet even there, little remains. Frederick the Great, though he may have felt something privately, did not immortalize her in words. His writings, so rich with wit and sharpness, are almost silent on his sister. If grief was felt, it left no echo. Silence followed her into the grave. And yet, silence can be louder than words. The absence of recognition speaks volumes. It tells us that Amelia's life, already erased, was erased again in death. Her funeral was duty, not love. Her memory, obligation, not reverence. But perhaps the greatest cruelty lies in the contrast. While others in her family had their names carved into treaties, dynasties, and monuments, Amelia had only a stone, later lost. While others left heirs to carry their blood forward, Amelia's line ended with her. Her death marked not a transition, not the closing of an era, but the vanishing of a presence that had barely been noticed while alive. And yet, one must imagine those last moments. A woman who had once been a child in a militarized court. A sister who had grown beneath the brilliance and shadow of Frederick. A princess who had never worn a crown, never stood in a procession of triumph. Lying in a quiet chamber, her breath slowing, her thoughts known only to herself. Did she think of what might have been? Did she think of her mother, long gone, whose love she had cherished? Did she think of art, of music, of the fleeting moments when she had felt alive? Or did she think of nothing? Too weary for memory, too tired for regret? We cannot know. We will never know. That is the nature of forgotten lives. What remains is only the fact. Amelia of Prussia died at 63, of cancer and despair. She left no heirs. She left no political mark. She left no memoirs, no letters, no great deeds. Her grave was lost to war. Her name survived only in genealogies, in lists, in whispers. And yet, even in silence, her death tells us something. It tells us how dynasties consume their daughters. It tells us how women born into palaces could die as though they never lived. It tells us that history remembers not only through glory, but also through absence. Her end was not scandalous, not violent, not dramatic. It was, in many ways, worse. It was invisible. And in that invisibility lies the purest form of tragedy. History loves its heroes. It loves its conquerors, its kings, its queens, who bend empires to their will. It raises statues for the victorious. It carves names into marble. It preserves glory in stone and song. But history has little room for the silent ones. Amelia of Prussia was one of them. A princess born into the iron household of Frederick William I, a sister overshadowed by Frederick the Great. A woman denied marriage, denied heirs, denied power. She lived a life of absence, and she died in silence. Her story is not about triumph, it is about erasure. Look through the annals of the 18th century, and you will see kings, generals, philosophers. You will see Frederick's victories, Voltaire's letters, Catherine the Great's rise. Amelia appears only faintly, like a smudge on the corner of a painting. There, but not there. Real but unreal. A name without narrative, and yet that is what makes her story haunting. Because Amelia represents the fate of so many women born into royalty, yet denied its supposed privilege. Their names do not fill the history books. Their portraits are lost. Their voices vanish. They were born in palaces, but lived as prisoners of neglect. Their tragedy is not that they were hated. It is that they were forgotten. Forgotten while alive. Forgotten in death. Forgotten still. We search for meaning in Amelia's life, and we find shadows. We search for legacy, and we find silence. But in that silence, there is a reflection of a deeper truth. History is selective. It tells the stories it wants to tell. It keeps the brilliant, the victorious, the scandalous. It discards the rest. Amelia of Prussia is the discarded rest. But think of what she endured. The rigid childhood in a militarized court. The humiliation of remaining unmarried. The quiet refuge in art, never enough to fill the void. The slow agony of illness. The endless weight of melancholy. The lonely final years, shut away, waiting for death. Her life is a mirror held up to power. It shows us what happens when worth is measured only in victories and alliances. It shows us how fragile identity becomes when it depends on others. A father, a brother, a husband who never came. It shows us the cruelty of a system that gave women titles but not meaning. And so, Amelia stands for more than herself. She stands for all the forgotten daughters of Europe's dynasties, for every princess who faded in silence, for every royal woman whose name is only a footnote, if mentioned at all. Her grave was lost, her memory was scattered. But her story, when told, reveals the cost of history's indifference. In the end, Amelia was called nothing, no epithet, no the great, no the wise, no the beloved, only Amelia. And even that name dissolved into obscurity. Yet perhaps, in speaking her story now, we give her something history denied: remembrance. We cannot change her fate. We cannot erase her pain, but we can refuse to let her name be buried completely. We can say, there was Amelia of Prussia. She lived, she suffered, she mattered. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy is not to die, but to die forgotten. And if you want more stories like this, stories of forgotten queens, tragic kings, and the silent shadows of history, make sure to subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Here, every shadow has a voice. Every silence has a story.